I was on my way to the airport when I realized I'd left my passport at home. But the moment I walked back inside and heard my husband talking upstairs, I froze. I stepped closer, and what I heard made my hands tremble and my blood run cold. Can you imagine spending 7 years building a life with someone, only to discover in one heart-stopping moment that your entire marriage was nothing more than an elaborate, soul-crushing lie? That everything you believed about the person you loved was a carefully constructed performance designed to utterly destroy you? It all started with something so mundane, so ridiculously simple, that it still feels like a cosmic joke. I was halfway to JFK, already mentally running through my London conference keynote, when a cold dread washed over me. My passport. I'd left it on my nightstand, that single, crucial item, after checking the expiration date one last time. In that instant, it felt catastrophic, threatening to derail the biggest professional moment of my life. 6 months of preparation gone. So, I took the next exit, my mind already racing to calculate which later flights I could possibly catch. I was flying back to Brooklyn Heights, consumed by a singular mission: retrieve the passport, get back on the road. But when I walked back into our brownstone, the front door was unlocked. That should have been my first warning. Jackson never, ever left doors unlocked. He was meticulous about security, but I was too focused, too stressed, too utterly oblivious to the true nature of the trap I was walking into. Then I heard his voice. It drifted down from upstairs, casual, intimate, utterly unlike anything he used with me. And the words? They stopped me cold. He was talking about property transfers, foreclosure proceedings, how easy it had been to deceive me. My blood turned to ice. My legal training, that instinct to gather information, took over. I moved closer to the staircase, silent, holding my breath. What I heard in the next 60 seconds shattered my world into a million pieces. My husband wasn't who I thought he was. Our marriage? A fiction. And I was standing in my own home, listening to him plan my complete destruction, while he thought I was safely on my way to another continent. The drive back to Brooklyn had felt like forever, but the return trip was a blur. My mind replayed the morning, searching for signs, for clues, for anything I'd missed. Jackson had woken up before me, like he often did when I traveled. He'd been in the kitchen, making French toast, my favorite, with cinnamon, and brewing my coffee already poured into my travel mug. He'd kissed me, his hand warm on the small of my back, telling me he'd miss me terribly for the next 5 days. And I'd believed every single word. Why wouldn't I? 7 years of marriage had given me no reason to doubt his sincerity, no reason to question his love. This London conference wasn't just a work trip. It was everything I'd worked for since taking over my father's company 4 years ago. As Chief Risk Officer of Thornfield Security Solutions, I was giving the keynote speech on AI security, an invitation from the European Cybersecurity Alliance. Huge. I'd spent countless hours preparing, refining, anticipating questions from experts who would be scrutinizing my every word. This was my moment to prove myself, a woman leading in a field still dominated by men who often questioned my credentials before they even considered my ideas. My dad, who started Thornfield in a Red Hook warehouse. 2 employees, a handful of local clients. When he died suddenly, I was 28, a law degree in hand, 0 experience running a tech company. Everyone expected me to sell. The offers poured in after the funeral, competitors circling like vultures. They assumed grief and inexperience would make me an easy target. They were wrong. I spent 4 grueling years transforming his modest practice into a firm that now protected Fortune 500 companies, 40 employees, offices in 3 cities, annual revenue that would have made Dad incredibly proud. And Jackson? He was there through it all. We met at a legal conference, just 6 months after my father died. I was drowning in grief, overwhelmed by the responsibility of a company I barely understood. He approached me after my presentation on data protection. He seemed genuinely interested, asking intelligent questions, showing he'd actually listened. He was handsome in an understated way. Dark hair just graying at the temples. Blue eyes that truly saw me, not just the professional facade I'd learned to wear. Our courtship was so natural, so unhurried. Long conversations over dinner, sharing dreams and fears. He'd cook while I worked late, bringing me wine, checking in without making me feel guilty about the hours I poured into building the company. He never complained about my schedule, never demanded I choose. Instead, he supported me, encouraged me, became the person I trusted most in the world. When he proposed in the Finger Lakes, standing on a dock at sunset, the water glowing gold around us, I said yes without a single moment of hesitation. Our wedding was small, intimate, in my mother's garden. Jackson cried when he saw me walking down the aisle. I remember thinking my heart would burst from happiness. My mother hugged him, whispering that my father would have loved him, that she was so grateful I had found someone to take care of me. Jackson was especially wonderful with my mother after we married. She lived alone in the Cobble Hill brownstone where I grew up, the same house where my father carried her over the threshold in 1985. It wasn't just a house, it was 3 generations of family history, memories embedded in every room. Dad's presence lingered in the garden he planted, the bookshelves he built. After he passed, Mom struggled. The ground floor rental units needed constant maintenance. Tenant issues, repairs, property taxes that kept climbing as the neighborhood gentrified. It was overwhelming, and I watched her confidence dwindle. Jackson volunteered to help. Weekends spent fixing leaky faucets, reviewing financial documents that made her eyes glaze over. I was so grateful for him, caring for my mother as if she were his own. He was patient in ways I sometimes struggled to be, never making her feel foolish. When he suggested consolidating some family accounts to simplify management, it felt like such a thoughtful solution from someone who genuinely wanted to ease our burdens. My mother signed the power of attorney documents he prepared, trusting him completely. I countersigned them, barely glancing at the fine print. I was too busy with a major client presentation to scrutinize paperwork for my own husband. We were handing him the keys to everything my parents had built, and neither of us had any idea what we were doing. Now, I stood in the foyer, gripping the banister, so tightly my knuckles were white. Jackson's voice drifted down from his 3rd-floor office, completely different. There was satisfaction in it, almost pleasure, as he discussed property transfers and foreclosure proceedings with someone he called sweetheart. That word, it made my chest clench. He'd never called me sweetheart. Honey, babe, sure, but sweetheart? That belonged to someone else. I forced myself to stay absolutely still, listening. My legal training kicked in, overriding the primal urge to run up those stairs and confront him. Gather information first. Never make accusations without evidence. These principles served me well in business. Now, I applied them to my crumbling marriage without even thinking. Jackson was saying how I'd just left for the airport, how the stupid woman had believed the London story. Each word was a physical assault, landing with devastating impact. He talked about documents being ready, about my mother's house being in foreclosure by Tuesday, how I'd signed everything myself and actually thanked him for helping with the family finances. My mother's house, the brownstone in Cobble Hill that held every memory of my childhood, every piece of my father that we had left. He was talking about it like it was just another property, another asset to liquidate. Then, the words that changed everything. After all these years of pretending to love that frigid, controlling woman, I'm finally going to get what I deserve, what we both deserve, sweetheart. Pretending. 7 years of marriage reduced to a performance. 7 years of my love met with contempt I'd been too blind to see. I stood there, and something fundamental shifted inside me, something that felt like a death and a rebirth happening simultaneously. The trusting, loving, perhaps naive woman who had walked out of this house 40 minutes ago no longer existed. The woman standing here now was different, colder, her mind already working through the implications with the same analytical precision I applied to cybersecurity threats. Jackson believed I was gone. He thought he had 5 days to finalize his scheme, while I was blissfully ignorant across an ocean. He had no idea I was standing 20 feet below him, listening to every word. My legal mind began to catalog evidence, to construct a strategy. My hands were shaking, not from fear, not even from heartbreak. They were shaking from rage that felt like electricity running through my veins, from the sudden, gut-wrenching understanding that I had been living inside an elaborate con for 7 years, and from the cold determination to make Jackson pay for every single lie. I needed to hear more. Every instinct screamed at me to confront him, to demand answers. But my training held me. Evidence first, understanding second, action third. I moved closer to the staircase with deliberate care, placing each foot precisely to avoid the groaning third step from the bottom, the loose board near the railing on the landing. 7 years of living here had taught me its language, and now that knowledge was my protection. Jackson's voice continued, perfectly clear. Our brownstone, built in 1920, had high ceilings and original woodwork that carried sound in unexpected ways. A private conversation on the 3rd floor could be heard distinctly in the foyer if you knew where to stand. I positioned myself where the acoustics were sharpest, forcing my breathing to slow. No, don't worry, he was saying, his tone reassuring in a way that made my stomach churn. By the time she gets back in 5 days, everything will be locked down. Property transfer documents are ready. Her mother's brownstone will be in foreclosure by Tuesday. The old woman doesn't even check her accounts anymore. My mother's brownstone, $2 million in the current market, but its value went far beyond money. 3 generations of my family had lived there. My grandmother died in the upstairs bedroom. My father proposed to my mother in the garden. I took my first steps on those hardwood floors. Every brick held a memory, and Jackson was discussing it casually, like another transaction. And the best part, he continued, and I could hear the smile in his voice, the smug satisfaction of someone who believed himself clever and untouchable. She signed everything herself, every single document over the past year. She actually thanked me for helping manage the family properties while she was so busy with work. The memory came rushing back, sickeningly clear. 8 months ago, a stack of papers on the kitchen table. He explained it would make everything easier, that Mom was confused by multiple bank statements. I was preparing for a major client presentation, laptop open, mind already on security protocols. I signed where he indicated without reading carefully, trusting him completely, because he was my husband. Why would my husband hurt me? After all these years of pretending to love that frigid, controlling woman, Jackson said, his voice hardening, growing colder. I'm finally going to get what I deserve, what we both deserve. Sweetheart. He was talking to someone else. Someone who was not his wife. His partner in this scheme, his co-conspirator in the destruction of my life. The betrayal doubled in that instant, multiplying into something so vast I could barely comprehend its dimensions. This wasn't just theft, not just fraud. This was an intimate violation by someone I had shared a bed with, someone I had trusted with my body and my heart and my family's legacy. I heard him laugh at something the other woman said. That genuine sound of amusement I had always believed I inspired in him. The laugh I fell in love with. Except now, I understood it had never been for me. Perhaps nothing had ever been for me. Perhaps I'd been living with a stranger who wore my husband's face, performing affection with practiced skill, while feeling nothing but contempt. She'll land in London completely clueless, Jackson continued. I've already scheduled the bank appointments for tomorrow morning. The foreclosure auction is set for Tuesday afternoon. By Wednesday, we'll have control of the property and can flip it immediately. The market in Cobble Hill is insane right now. We're looking at a clean $700,000 profit after paying off the mortgage and the equity line. $700,000. That was what my mother's home was worth to him. Not the memories, the history, the fact that an elderly woman who had already lost her husband would now lose the only place that felt like home. Just numbers on a balance sheet. Profit to be extracted. "I know, baby," he said, his voice softening with affection that made my chest physically ache. "Just a few more days and we're done. We can finally stop pretending and get out of here. Maybe somewhere warm this time. You've been talking about Costa Rica. We could do that. Buy something on the beach. The life we've been planning for all these years." Costa Rica. The beach house. The life they had been planning. While I worked 60-hour weeks, building a company. While I traveled for conferences and client meetings. While I trusted him to be the stable foundation of our marriage. He had been planning an escape. With another woman. Planning to steal everything and disappear. Leaving me with nothing but the wreckage of a life I thought was real. I should have felt devastated. I should have collapsed right there on the floor, broken. Instead, something else was happening inside me. Something cold, sharp, and focused. The shock was transforming into clarity. The pain crystallizing into purpose. My mind began working through the implications with the same analytical precision I applied to cybersecurity threats at work. Jackson believed I was at the airport. He thought I was boarding a flight that would take me out of the country for 5 days. He had no idea I was standing in our home, listening to every word, learning the full scope of his plan. That ignorance, that was a weapon I could use. That temporary advantage was everything. I heard him moving around upstairs, his footsteps crossing the office floor. "I should go," he said to the woman on the phone. "I've got to meet with the attorney this afternoon to finalize the paperwork. I'll call you tonight after everything's signed. Love you, baby. Love you." He told her he loved her with the same casual ease most people used to say goodbye. How many times had he said those words to me while meaning absolutely nothing? How many moments of intimacy had been nothing but performance, calculation, strategic manipulation designed to keep me compliant and trusting? I heard the click of his phone disconnecting, then silence. He was probably reviewing documents, checking his timeline, making sure every piece of his plan was perfectly positioned. He had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. No reason to believe his perfect scheme had just been exposed by something as mundane as a forgotten passport. I backed away from the stairs with the same careful precision I had used to approach them. The floorboard near the coat closet, the slight squeak in the hardwood by the door. I avoided them all, moving like a ghost through my own home until I reached the front door and eased it open just wide enough to slip through. The door closed behind me with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet street. I walked to my car with measured steps, though every nerve in my body screamed at me to run. My hands fumbled with the keys, and I had to try twice before I could get the door unlocked. Once inside, I sat motionless for several long minutes, staring at our brownstone through the windshield, trying to reconcile the building I had loved with the crime scene it had just become. My phone sat in the cup holder where I'd placed it during the drive back from the highway. I picked it up and stared at the screen, watching it blur as tears finally came. Not tears of sadness, tears of rage, so intense they felt like they were burning my eyes. I had built a life with this man. I had trusted him with everything that mattered. I had believed in our future together with a kind of faith that now seemed impossibly naive. But crying wouldn't help. Falling apart wouldn't protect my mother or save her home or recover what had been stolen. I needed to think clearly, to move strategically, to become someone Jackson had never anticipated I could be. The woman who had driven away 40 minutes ago would have confronted him immediately, demanded explanations, probably believed whatever lies he told her. That woman was gone. The woman sitting in this car now understood that she was at war. And the first rule of war was to never let your enemy know you were coming. I started the engine and pulled away from the curb, forcing myself to drive at a normal speed, even though every instinct told me to floor the accelerator and put as much distance as possible between myself and that brownstone. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my fingers ached, but the physical pain helped ground me, kept me focused on what needed to happen next, rather than what I had just discovered. Jackson believed I was at the airport right now. He thought I was checking in for my flight, going through security, boarding a plane that would carry me across the Atlantic and leave him free to execute his plan without interference. That belief was the only advantage I had, and I needed to protect it at all costs. I couldn't go home. I couldn't contact him. I couldn't do anything that would alert him to the fact that his carefully constructed timeline had just been shattered by something as mundane as a forgotten passport. I drove through Brooklyn with no clear destination at first, just moving, putting distance between myself and the life that had revealed itself to be a carefully staged performance. My phone sat in the cup holder, and I kept glancing at it, half expecting Jackson to call and somehow know that I had overheard everything. But the screen remained dark and silent. He had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. In his mind, I was already gone. After nearly 10 minutes of driving on autopilot, I found myself pulling into the parking lot of a coffee shop in Park Slope, 3 neighborhoods away from Brooklyn Heights. It was a place I had never been before, somewhere Jackson would have no reason to look for me, even if he somehow discovered I hadn't boarded my flight. The coffee shop was quiet at this hour, with only a few customers scattered at tables, most of them absorbed in laptops or books. I chose a booth in the back corner where I could see the entrance, but remain relatively hidden from casual observation. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone. I needed help, but I needed to be strategic about who I contacted and what I revealed. The wrong move now could destroy everything. I took several deep breaths, forcing myself to think clearly despite the adrenaline still coursing through my system. Years of managing crisis situations at work had taught me that panic was the enemy of effective action. Assessment first, strategy second, implementation third. The first call went to Diana, my executive assistant. She answered on the second ring, her voice carrying its usual professional efficiency. "Mia, you should be boarding soon. Is everything okay?" "I need you to do something for me," I said, keeping my voice as steady as possible. "And I need you not to ask questions right now. Can you do that?" There was a brief pause. I could almost hear her recalculating, recognizing the seriousness in my tone. Diana had worked for me for 6 years. She knew when something was genuinely wrong. "Of course. What do you need?" "Call the conference organizers in London. Tell them I've had a family emergency and cannot attend. Then I need you to cover for me at the office. If anyone asks where I am, tell them I'm at the conference as scheduled. Unreachable except by email." Another pause, longer this time. "Mia, what's going on? Are you safe?" That simple question nearly shattered the composure I was desperately trying to maintain. Diana wasn't just an employee. She had become a friend over the years, someone who noticed when I was stressed, who brought me coffee during long afternoons. The concern in her voice made tears prick at my eyes, but I forced them back. "I'm safe," I managed to say. "I promise I'll explain everything soon, but right now I need you to trust me and do exactly what I'm asking." "You're in London," Diana said quietly. "Got it, Mia. Whatever's happening, I've got your back." I ended the call before my voice could break and sat staring at my phone screen for a long moment. One step completed. Now for the harder part. Vanessa had been my college roommate, the person who had seen me through my father's death and the terrifying early months of running Thornfield when I had no idea what I was doing. After graduation, she became a forensic accountant, specializing in tracking hidden assets and uncovering financial fraud for law firms and private clients. We still met for dinner once a month, maintaining the kind of deep friendship that survives distance and busy careers. If anyone could help me understand the scope of what Jackson had done, it was Vanessa. She answered on the first ring. "Mia, I thought you were flying to London today." "I need your help," I said. And this time, I couldn't keep the slight tremor out of my voice. "And I need absolute confidentiality. Can you come to Brooklyn right now?" "What's wrong? You sound strange." "Please, Vanessa, I can't explain over the phone. Can you come?" "I'm in my office in Manhattan. I can be there in 30 minutes. I gave her the address of the coffee shop and hung up, then ordered a coffee I had no intention of drinking, just to justify occupying the booth. The barista was young, probably a college student, and she smiled at me with an automatic friendliness that felt completely disconnected from the reality I was living in. I carried my coffee back to the booth and sat staring at the steam rising from the cup, watching it twist and dissipate. Vanessa arrived in 28 minutes, her red hair pulled back in a professional bun, her expression shifting from concern to alarm as she slid into the booth across from me and got a good look at my face. "Talk to me," she said simply. So I told her. Everything. The conversation about property transfers and foreclosures. My mother's brownstone being sold out from under her. The documents I had signed without understanding. The woman Jackson called Sweetheart, his partner in whatever scheme he'd been running. By the time I finished, Vanessa's expression had transformed from alarm into the cold, professional focus I'd seen her use when analyzing financial records in court cases. "We need to look at your accounts," she said, already pulling her laptop from her bag. "All of them. Joint accounts, investment portfolios, property holdings, everything. And we need to do it right now before he has any chance to realize." "You know, I can access most of it from my phone," I said, pulling up my banking app, with fingers that still trembled slightly. What we discovered over the next 2 hours made the initial shock of overhearing Jackson's conversation seem almost quaint by comparison. Vanessa worked with methodical precision, guiding me through accessing accounts I had barely looked at in months because I had trusted my husband to manage our finances competently. Trust. That word kept echoing in my head with increasingly bitter irony. The joint checking account looked normal at first glance. Regular deposits from my salary. Normal expenses for groceries, utilities, mortgage payments. But when Vanessa started examining the transaction history more carefully, patterns emerged that made my stomach turn. Small transfers out of the account, usually between $1,500 and $3,000, happening every few weeks for the past 18 months. The amounts were carefully calibrated to stay below the threshold that would trigger automatic fraud alerts from the bank. "Where is this money going?" I asked, watching Vanessa's fingers fly across her keyboard. "An account registered to something called Hearthstone Properties," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Give me a few minutes. I need to make some calls." She stepped outside to use her phone, speaking in the abbreviated, technical shorthand of financial forensic specialists. I sat alone in the booth, watching her through the window. She made 3 calls, each one progressively longer, and with each conversation, her expression grew grimmer. When she finally came back inside and sat down across from me, I knew the news was going to be worse than I had imagined. "Mia," she said carefully, "Jackson Rohrbrennan is not his real name. Or rather, Brennan is not his original surname." She turned her laptop screen toward me, and I found myself staring at a criminal record. Jackson Rohr, convicted of investment fraud in Connecticut 8 years ago, served 2 years in a minimum security prison, released on parole, and immediately filed for a legal name change, adding Brennan as a surname to create a fresh identity that wouldn't trigger background checks or raise red flags with potential victims. 8 years ago, 1 year before I met him at that legal conference in Manhattan, 1 year before he approached me after my presentation with what I had believed was genuine interest in my work. Everything had been calculated from the very first moment. "There's more," Vanessa said quietly, and she pulled up social media profiles on her screen. A woman named Sienna Hartley, 26 years old, blonde and beautiful, her Instagram feed filled with luxury vacations and designer purchases. And there in the background of a beach photo, partially obscured but unmistakable, was Jackson. She's his partner, Vanessa said. They're listed as co-owners of Hearthstone Properties. And Mia, they've done this before. My phone buzzed with a text message around midnight. The screen glowed in the darkness of my hotel room, and I stared at the words with a detachment that felt almost surreal. Missing you already. Hope the flight wasn't too rough. Call me when you land tomorrow morning. He had even added a heart emoji, that small digital symbol that was supposed to represent affection, but now felt like mockery. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I calculated the time difference, thought about when someone arriving in London after an overnight flight would reasonably be expected to call, and made a note to contact him at the appropriate hour. Every detail mattered now. Every action had to support the fiction that I was exactly where he believed me to be. But sleep wouldn't come that night. I lay in the unfamiliar bed of the Lower Manhattan hotel where I had checked in under Diana's name, staring at the ceiling and thinking about my mother. She would be asleep right now in the Cobble Hill brownstone, completely unaware that the home she had lived in for 40 years was being stolen from her. Jackson had scheduled the foreclosure auction for Tuesday. Today was Thursday. I had 5 days to stop it, but first I needed to understand exactly what he had done. Morning arrived with gray light filtering through the hotel curtains. I showered and dressed mechanically, then drove to Cobble Hill before I could second-guess the decision. My mother was an early riser, always had been, and I knew I would find her awake, even at 7 in the morning. The brownstone looked exactly as it always had, its brick facade warm in the morning sun. The garden my father had planted still, thriving despite his absence. I sat in my car for several minutes, gathering courage for a conversation I desperately did not want to have. How do you tell your mother that the man she trusted, the man who had fixed her leaking faucets and reviewed her bank statements and treated her with such apparent kindness, had been systematically robbing her? She answered the door in her bathrobe, surprise and pleasure crossing her face when she saw me. Mia, sweetheart, what are you doing here? I thought you were flying to London yesterday. Change of plans, Mom. Can I come in? She stepped aside, already moving toward the kitchen to make coffee. That automatic hospitality that had been ingrained in her since childhood. I followed her through rooms filled with furniture that had witnessed 3 generations of family life, past photographs on the walls showing my father's face frozen in moments of happiness, to the kitchen where sunlight streamed through windows overlooking the garden. Is everything all right? She asked, setting 2 mugs on the counter. You look tired. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Can you show me any paperwork Jackson has given you recently? Anything related to the house or your bank accounts? Her expression shifted from pleasant concern to confusion. What's this about, Mia? Please, Mom, just show me what you have. She disappeared into the small office off the living room, the space my father had used to manage household finances, and returned with a folder containing documents I had never seen before. I spread them across the kitchen table and felt my stomach drop as I read through page after page of legal paperwork that my mother had signed without understanding. Jackson had refinanced the brownstone 18 months ago, taking out a new mortgage that was nearly double the remaining balance on the original loan. He had also opened a home equity line of credit for an additional $200,000. The documents were sophisticated, filled with legal language that would have confused anyone without a background in real estate law. And Jackson had explained them to my mother as routine administrative updates that would lower her monthly expenses and simplify her financial management. You said this would make things easier, my mother said, quietly watching me read. You said the payments would go down. I never said that, Mom. Jackson said that, but he signed to right here. She pointed to a signature line, and I saw my own name written in handwriting that was close enough to mine to pass casual inspection, but not quite right in the details. The forgery was good, professional, the work of someone who had practiced. "When did he have you sign these?" I asked, keeping my voice as steady as possible. "About a year and a half ago. He brought them by one afternoon when you were traveling for work. He said you had already reviewed everything and approved it, that he just needed my signature to finalize the paperwork. I trusted him, Mia. He's your husband. Why wouldn't I trust him?" I pulled up my banking app and accessed my mother's accounts using the information she had given me years ago for emergencies. What I found made the room tilt slightly. The refinancing had generated over $300,000 in cash, money that should have been deposited into my mother's account. Instead, it had vanished into accounts registered to Hearthstone Properties, the shell company Vanessa had identified. The monthly mortgage payments had not been made in 4 months. Late fees and penalties had accumulated. The bank had filed foreclosure proceedings 2 weeks ago, sending notices to a post office box that Jackson controlled. "Mom," I said carefully, "when was the last time you actually received a bank statement in the mail?" She thought about it, confusion deepening on her face. Jackson said he had everything switched to electronic statements to save paper. He said he would review them and let me know if there were any problems. Of course he had. He had intercepted every piece of communication that might have alerted her to what was happening. She had been living in her home with no idea that she was about to lose it. "Your house is in foreclosure," I told her, the words feeling like stones in my mouth. "The auction is scheduled for Tuesday." The color drained from her face. She sat down heavily in one of the kitchen chairs, her hand reaching out to grip the table edge. "That's not possible. Jackson said everything was fine. He said the new mortgage made everything easier." "Jackson has been stealing from you, Mom. From both of us. And I'm going to stop him. But I need you to trust me now and not contact him about any of this. Can you do that?" She nodded slowly, tears beginning to track down her face, and I felt rage burn through me with renewed intensity. This wasn't just about money or property. This was about destroying an elderly woman's sense of security, about taking advantage of her grief and vulnerability, about violating the trust she had extended to someone she believed was family. I spent the next 2 hours with my mother, going through every document Jackson had ever given her, photographing everything with my phone. Then I called Vanessa and gave her the information she needed to trace where the money had gone and document the fraud. My mother sat in silence through most of this, occasionally wiping tears from her face, struggling to process the reality that the man who had seemed so helpful had been systematically robbing her. "I should have paid more attention," she said finally. "I should have asked more questions. This is not your fault, Mom. Jackson is a professional. This is what he does. He targets people who are vulnerable and trusting, and he manipulates them so skillfully that they never see it coming." But even as I said those words, I felt the weight of my own guilt. I had brought Jackson into our lives. I had vouched for him, trusted him, given him access to everything that mattered. If anyone should have seen through his performance, it should have been me. That afternoon, I drove to Martin's office in downtown Manhattan, the corporate attorney who had handled Thornfield's legal matters since my father first started the company. I had called ahead to tell him I needed to see him urgently and privately, that I couldn't come to Thornfield's offices because I was supposed to be in London and couldn't risk being seen by employees who might mention it to Jackson. Martin's office occupied the 42nd floor of a glass tower overlooking the East River. All polished surfaces and expensive art that projected competence and success. He met me in a private conference room, his expression grave as I laid out everything Vanessa had discovered about Jackson's true identity and the scope of his fraud. "I need to know if the company is vulnerable," I told him, spreading documents across the conference table. "If he's been stealing from me personally and from my mother, what's to stop him from going after Thornfield?" Martin reviewed the papers with increasing alarm, his expression darkening as he recognized the sophistication of the forgeries. "These are good," he said quietly. "Really good. Someone with inside knowledge of how your corporate paperwork is structured created these. He pulled up digital files on his laptop, comparing the forged documents to legitimate ones in Thornfield's records. The similarities were disturbing. Jackson had somehow gained access to corporate templates, authorization forms, insurance documents that should have been completely secure. If he presents these to the right people at the right time, Martin said, he could potentially freeze company assets pending resolution of ownership questions. He could make a claim against the business in a divorce proceeding. He might even be able to position himself as having a stake in the company through some of these forged authorizations. My father's legacy, everything I had built over 4 years of relentless work, all of it vulnerable because I had trusted the wrong person. What do we do? I asked. We file protective orders immediately. Emergency injunctions preventing any transfer of corporate assets or ownership claims. I'll have them drafted and filed within 2 hours. I left Martin's office feeling slightly less powerless, but no less angry. Jackson had not just targeted me. He had targeted everything and everyone I cared about. My mother, my company, the legacy my father had left behind. That evening, I returned to my hotel room and did something I had been avoiding since this nightmare began. I called Jackson, not from my regular phone, but from a burner device Vanessa had purchased for me, routing the call through a VPN service that would make it appear I was calling from London. Every detail had to be perfect. Every element of the performance had to be flawless. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm with what I now recognized as manufactured affection. Hey, babe, how was your first day at the conference? I forced myself to sound tired but enthusiastic, the way someone would after a long day of presentations and networking. Exhausting but good. The keynote this morning was fascinating, all about quantum encryption protocols. I took so many notes my hand is cramping. That sounds like you, he said with a laugh that used to make me smile. Always the perfectionist. Did you get a chance to eat anything, or were you too busy impressing everyone? The casual intimacy in his tone made my skin crawl, but I maintained my composure. Grabbed a sandwich between sessions. The time difference is hitting me harder than I expected. I think I'm going to turn in early tonight. Good idea. Get some rest. I miss you. Miss you too, I said, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. I'll call you tomorrow after my presentation. After we hung up, I sat staring at the phone in my hand, marveling at how easily the deception had come. Was this what Jackson felt every time he spoke to me? This strange disconnect between the words being spoken and the reality underneath? The thought made me feel sick, but I pushed the feeling aside. There would be time for processing the emotional damage later. Right now, I needed to focus on strategy. The next morning, Friday, I met with Vanessa in a different coffee shop, this one in the financial district near where Sienna lived. Vanessa had spent the past 2 days tracing every financial thread of Jackson's operation, and the picture she had assembled was staggering in its scope and audacity. $647,000, she said, sliding a folder across the table toward me. That's how much they've taken from you and your mother combined. But there's more in accounts tied to previous victims. I estimate they've stolen close to $2 million over the past decade. $2 million. Multiple lives destroyed. And for what? So Jackson and Sienna could live in luxury apartments and take expensive vacations while their victims struggled to rebuild from the wreckage. I found something else, Vanessa continued, her expression grim. Rachel Montgomery, the doctor in Connecticut. She's not the first victim. There was a woman before her. Patricia Ellis. She was an investment banker in Boston. Jackson and Sienna took her for nearly $800,000 9 years ago. After they disappeared with her money, Patricia tried to rebuild, but the stress triggered a heart condition she didn't know she had. She died 6 months later. She was 39 years old. The folder contained photographs Vanessa had pulled from old social media accounts and news articles. Patricia Ellis smiling at a charity gala. Patricia Ellis receiving an award for financial excellence. Patricia Ellis's obituary, listing a heart attack as cause of death, but making no mention of the fraud that had preceded it. They killed her, I said quietly. Maybe not directly, but they killed her just the same. And Lauren Prescott killed herself after they destroyed her, Vanessa added. Mia, these people are not just thieves. They're predators who leave bodies behind them. If we don't stop them now, completely and permanently, they'll just do this again to someone else. I knew she was right. Protecting myself and my mother was not enough. This had to end in a way that ensured Jackson and Sienna could never hurt anyone again. That afternoon, I did something that even Vanessa thought was risky. I went to Sienna's apartment in the financial district. I had prepared carefully, dressing in professional attire that suggested business rather than confrontation, carrying a leather portfolio that contained a hidden recording device. When I knocked on her door, I wore an expression of friendly professionalism that gave away nothing of the rage burning beneath the surface. Sienna answered, wearing designer athleisure, where that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She was even more striking in person than in her social media photos, with the kind of effortless beauty that came from expensive maintenance and genetic luck. Her expression was friendly but cautious, the weariness of someone who lived a life built on deception and had learned to evaluate threats quickly. "Can I help you?" she asked, not opening the door fully. "I hope so. My name is Jennifer Ross. I'm a freelance journalist writing a feature about young entrepreneurs in the property investment space. Your name came up in my research, and I was hoping you might have a few minutes to talk about your success with Hearthstone Properties." I watched her expression shift from caution to interest. Greed and vanity, the twin weaknesses that made con artists vulnerable to being con themselves. She opened the door wider and gestured me inside. Her apartment was exactly what I had expected. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. Furniture that belonged in design magazines. Art on the walls that was either very expensive or very good reproductions. Everything about the space screamed money, and I knew with certainty that none of it had been earned. "Honestly, I'm always happy to talk about my work," Sienna said, settling onto a white leather sofa and gesturing for me to sit across from her. "What specifically would you like to know?" I asked her questions about property investment, about her business model, about how she had achieved such success at a young age. She answered with practiced smoothness, weaving a story about market research and smart investments and taking calculated risks. Every word was a lie, but she delivered the lies with complete confidence. After about 15 minutes of this performance, I shifted the conversation slightly. "I'm particularly interested in how you identify undervalued properties. What's your process for finding opportunities that other investors might miss?" "Well, it's really about understanding human psychology," she said, warming to the topic. "People make emotional decisions about property, especially when they're in vulnerable situations. If you can identify those situations early, you can position yourself to acquire assets at below market value." Vulnerable situations. She was describing her victims without even realizing it. "That's fascinating," I said, leaning forward slightly. "Can you give me a specific example? Obviously, nothing confidential, but maybe a general scenario of how this works in practice." She hesitated for just a moment, and I could see her calculating whether to continue. But the combination of flattery and what she perceived as journalistic interest won out over caution. "Okay, so for instance, there's a property in Cobble Hill we're closing on next week. The owner is an elderly woman who got overwhelmed managing the building after her husband died. We helped her refinance to make things easier, and now we're positioned to acquire the property at the foreclosure auction for about 60% of its market value. Once we flip it, we're looking at a profit of around $700,000. My mother's house. She was sitting in her luxury apartment, discussing the theft of my mother's home with the casual indifference of someone describing a routine business transaction. The recording device in my portfolio captured every word. "That's impressive," I said, keeping my voice neutral despite the fury building in my chest. And you do this with a partner, correct? Jackson Brennan. Jackson Roar, she corrected automatically, then caught herself. I mean, yes, Jackson Brennan. We've been working together for years. I pulled out my phone and opened it to a photograph, not of Sienna and Jackson, but of Patricia Ellis and Lauren Prescott, the two victims whose lives had ended because of what Jackson and Sienna had done to them. Do you recognize these women? I asked, holding the phone where she could see the screen. Her face went pale. Who are you? My name is not Jennifer Ross. It's Mia Thornfield. And that property in Cobble Hill you're planning to steal? That's my mother's house. The one you and Jackson have been systematically robbing while he pretended to be my husband. She stood up quickly, backing toward the door. I think you need to leave. These women are dead, I continued, my voice remaining calm despite the emotions churning inside me. Patricia Ellis and Lauren Prescott. Dead because of what you and Jackson did to them. How many others, Sienna? How many lives have you destroyed? Get out of my apartment, she said, her voice rising. Get out, or I'm calling the police. Please do, I said, standing but not moving toward the door. I'd love to explain to the police exactly what you and Jackson have been doing. I have documentation of everything. Bank records, forged documents, evidence of your previous victims. I've spent the last 3 days building a case that will put both of you in prison for a very long time. Her hand was on her phone, but she hadn't dialed yet. I could see her mind working, trying to calculate her options and finding them all closed off. Or, I continued, you could cooperate. Tell me everything. Every detail of your operation. Every account where you've hidden money. Every victim you've targeted. Do that, and maybe I'll mention your cooperation when I speak to the district attorney. She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw the exact instant when her survival instinct overrode her loyalty to Jackson. I want a lawyer, she said, and I want immunity. Then you better have something worth trading, I replied. Sienna sat back down on her white leather sofa, but the confident posture from earlier had vanished. Her shoulders were tight, her hands clasped together in her lap, and I could see her mind working through calculations that were rapidly producing unfavorable outcomes. She was cornered, and she knew it. I need to make a call, she said finally, her voice lacking the smooth confidence it had carried just minutes earlier. Go ahead, I replied, settling back into my chair with my portfolio still recording every word. But understand that the clock is ticking. Jackson is planning to execute your scheme tomorrow morning. Once he does that, you're both going down together. But if you cooperate with me now, before he makes his move, you might have something to bargain with. She picked up her phone, but didn't dial immediately. Instead, she stared at the screen as if it might provide answers to questions she was afraid to ask. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. How long have you known? 5 days. I came home for my passport and heard Jackson on the phone with you, discussing how stupid I was and how easy it had been to fool me. I've spent every moment since then building a case against both of you. She looked up at me, and for the first time I saw something other than calculation in her. Expression. Fear. Genuine and undisguised. He said you were in London. That's what he believes. That's what everyone believes, except the people helping me build the case against him. Against both of you. I want a deal, she said abruptly. Full immunity in exchange for everything I know. That's not my decision to make. But I can tell you that the district attorney will be a lot more interested in talking to you if you provide information before Jackson executes tomorrow morning than after. Right now, you're co-conspirators. But if you flip on him first, you become a witness instead of just another defendant. She made her call then, to a lawyer whose name I didn't recognize, speaking in hushed tones that I couldn't quite make out. The conversation lasted several minutes, and when she hung up, some of the fear had been replaced by a harder expression that suggested she had made a decision. My attorney says I should not talk to you without him present and without a formal agreement from the district attorney's office. Smart lawyer, I said, standing and collecting my portfolio. You should listen to him. But understand something, Sienna. Every hour you wait is an hour that Jackson gets closer to executing. And once he does that, your value as a cooperating witness drops significantly. Think about whether you want to go down with him or save yourself. I walked toward the door, then paused and turned back to face her. Patricia Ellis and Lauren Prescott. Those women are dead because of what you and Jackson did. You can't bring them back, but you can make sure there are no more victims after me. That has to mean something, even to someone like you. I left her apartment and returned to my car where Vanessa was waiting in the passenger seat. She had been monitoring the recording remotely through a device connected to my portfolio, and her expression was grim. She's going to flip, Vanessa said. I could hear it in her voice. She's more afraid of prison than she is loyal to Jackson. Good. Let her be afraid. Fear makes people tell the truth. Sunday evening arrived with the weight of everything that was about to happen pressing down on my shoulders. I sat in my hotel room and composed a text message to Jackson, routing it through the VPN to make it appear I was sending it from London. The message was simple and ordinary, exactly what he would expect from a wife returning from a business trip. Flight boarding soon. Should land around 8 a.m. your time. Can't wait to see you. His response came within seconds. Can't wait to see you two. I've missed you so much. Safe flight, babe. I stared at those words for a long time, thinking about how easily lies could be dressed up as affection, how skilled Jackson was at performing emotions he didn't feel. Then I turned off the phone and tried to sleep, knowing that tomorrow would require every ounce of strength and clarity I could summon. Monday morning came with gray clouds, threatening rain. I woke at 5, showered, and dressed in the navy suit my father had once complimented. The one, he said, made me look like someone who could command respect in any room. The memory of his words steadied me as I drove through empty Brooklyn streets toward our brownstone, parking across the street where I could watch the front door without being immediately visible. Jackson emerged at 8:30, exactly on schedule. He was dressed in a charcoal suit I had bought him for our anniversary 2 years ago, carrying the leather portfolio he used for important business meetings. He looked confident, purposeful, a man who believed himself to be on the verge of major success. He got into his car and pulled away from the curb, and I followed at a careful distance. His first destination was the bank in Cobble Hill that held my mother's mortgage. I knew from Martin's preparation that Jackson planned to finalize the foreclosure paperwork and arrange to purchase the property through one of his shell companies. What he didn't know was that Martin had spent the weekend coordinating with the bank's legal department, presenting evidence of fraud and securing their cooperation in what was about to happen. I parked half a block away and watched as Jackson walked through the bank's front doors. He was inside for less than 3 minutes before he came back out, and even from a distance, I could see that something had changed in his demeanor. His confident stride had been replaced by something quicker, more agitated. He was on his phone before he reached the sidewalk, his free hand gesturing sharply as he spoke to whoever was on the other end. I didn't need to hear the conversation to know what had happened. Martin had been waiting inside with the emergency court order staying the foreclosure, along with bank officials who had been briefed on the fraud investigation. Jackson's perfect plan had just encountered its first major obstacle, and he was trying to understand how it had happened. He got back in his car and drove toward Manhattan, and I continued following. His next stop would likely be his attorney's office, or perhaps he would try to access some of the accounts he had been planning to drain. Either way, he was about to discover that every avenue he had carefully constructed over the past 18 months had been blocked. But I wasn't ready to confront him yet. I wanted him to spend a few more hours trying to execute his scheme, running into barrier after barrier, watching his plan collapse piece by piece, before he understood who was responsible. Only then would I appear and let him see what his perfect victim had become. Instead, I drove back to Brooklyn Heights and let myself into our brownstone through the back entrance. I moved through the house quietly, gathering a few items I would need and securing copies of documents that would be evidence in the criminal case. I could hear Jackson's voice upstairs in his office, speaking on the phone with increasing frustration and urgency. "Something's wrong," he was saying. "The foreclosure was blocked. Emergency court order," they said. "And the bank accounts are frozen. Someone filed injunctions. Who could have done this? She's supposed to be in London. She doesn't even know." I climbed the stairs without trying to hide my footsteps this time. The third step from the bottom creaked under my weight, and I heard Jackson's voice cut off mid-sentence. When I reached the doorway of his office, he was standing by his desk with his phone still in his hand, staring at me with an expression of complete incomprehension. "Mia, what are you doing here? Why aren't you in London?" I stepped into the office, maintaining a distance that felt safe and strategic. "I never went to London, Jackson. I came back for my passport and heard you on the phone with Sienna, planning to steal everything from me and my mother. I've spent the last 5 days building a case against you." His face went through several rapid transformations: confusion, alarm, calculation, and finally an attempt at the concerned husband expression that had fooled me for 7 years. "I don't know what you think you heard, but you've clearly misunderstood something." "Let me explain." "Stop," I said, my voice cutting through his attempt at manipulation. "I know everything, Jackson. Or should I call you Jackson Rohr? That's your real name, isn't it? The one you used before you went to prison for fraud in Connecticut." He froze completely, every practiced expression falling away to reveal something raw and desperate underneath. "I know about Sienna," I continued. "I know about Patricia Ellis and Lauren Prescott and Rachel Montgomery. I know about the shell companies and the forged documents and the $600,000 you've stolen from me and my mother. And I know that right now every account you plan to drain is frozen. Every property you plan to steal is protected. And every institution you plan to defraud has been notified about who you really are." Jackson's mouth opened and closed without producing sound, his brain visibly struggling to process what was happening. The man who had been so confident just hours earlier, who had believed himself to be executing the perfect crime, was now standing in his own office facing the complete destruction of everything he had built. "You don't understand," he finally managed to say, his voice taking on a pleading quality I had never heard before. "It's not what you think. Yes, I made mistakes, but I can explain everything. We can work this out together." "Stop talking," I said, my voice carrying a coldness that surprised even me. "Every word out of your mouth is another lie, and I'm done listening to lies. The police are on their way. A detective from the district attorney's office will be here within the hour. You can save your explanations for them." He took a step toward me, and I instinctively moved back, my hand reaching for my phone. The movement stopped him, and I saw something shift in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, that the woman standing in front of him was not the person he had married, not the trusting victim he had spent 7 years cultivating. "Mia, please, just listen to me for 5 minutes. Let me explain how this happened, how things got out of control. I never meant for it to go this far. You never meant to steal $600,000 from me and my mother? You never meant to forge documents and commit fraud? You never meant to target me specifically after my father died because you saw me as vulnerable and wealthy? Which part of your decade-long pattern of destroying women's lives did you not mean to do, Jackson?" His face flushed red, anger finally breaking through the desperate attempt at manipulation. "You think you're so smart, don't you? Think you've won something here? You have no idea what you've done. You have no idea who you're dealing with." "Actually, I know exactly who I'm dealing with. Jackson Rohr, convicted fraudster, serial con artist, predator who has destroyed multiple lives and left at least 2 women dead. I know exactly who you are now. The only question is whether you understand who I am." The sound of sirens approaching made both of us turn toward the window. 3 police cars were pulling up in front of our brownstone, their lights flashing in the gray morning. Jackson's face went white as he watched officers emerge from the vehicles and approach the front door. "This is your fault," he said, turning back to me with venom in his voice. "You couldn't just let things be. You had to go digging, had to ruin everything. We could have worked this out quietly, but you had to make it into this." "No," I said firmly. "This is your fault. Every single consequence you're about to face is the direct result of choices you made. You chose to target me. You chose to steal from my mother. You chose to build your entire life on fraud and manipulation. Own it, Jackson. For once in your miserable existence, own what you've done." The doorbell rang, followed by heavy knocking. I walked past Jackson and down the stairs to let the police inside, leaving him standing alone in his office with nowhere left to run. The arrest was quick and professional. Detective Morrison from the district attorney's office read Jackson his rights, while 2 uniformed officers secured the scene and began collecting evidence. I watched from the living room as they led Jackson down the stairs in handcuffs, his expensive suit looking suddenly rumpled and wrong on him, his face a mask of barely controlled panic. As they walked him past where I was standing, he looked at me one final time. "I did love you," he said quietly. "At least in the beginning. That was real." "No, it wasn't," I replied. "And we both know it." They took him away, and I stood in the foyer of the brownstone that had been our home, feeling nothing but a strange emptiness where I thought there should be pain or triumph, or something more substantial than this hollow sense of conclusion. The next morning, I sat across from Detective Morrison in a conference room at the district attorney's office in downtown Brooklyn. Between us lay folders containing every piece of evidence I had gathered over the past week, organized with the same meticulous attention to detail I applied to cybersecurity assessments at work. "This is remarkable," Detective Morrison said, reviewing the timeline I had constructed, showing every transaction, every forged document, every point of contact between Jackson and his victims. "In 20 years of working fraud cases, I've never seen a victim present this level of documentation. Most people are so traumatized by discovering the fraud that they can barely function, let alone conduct an investigation." "I was traumatized," I said quietly, "but I was also angry, and I know how to conduct investigations. It's part of what I do professionally. I just applied those same skills to my personal situation." He nodded, making notes on a legal pad. "The recorded conversation with Sienna Hartley is particularly valuable. She admitted to knowing about the scheme, to targeting you specifically, to having done this to previous victims. That's going to be extremely difficult for her attorney to explain away. She called her lawyer after I left her apartment. I assume she's trying to negotiate some kind of deal." "She is," Detective Morrison confirmed. "Her attorney reached out yesterday afternoon. She wants full immunity in exchange for testifying against Jackson, providing documentation of their entire operation, and identifying other victims we might not know about." "Are you going to give her immunity?" He leaned back in his chair, considering the question carefully. "Probably not full immunity, but we might offer a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperation. The truth is, we need her testimony to make the strongest possible case against Jackson. She can describe their methodology, explain how they researched and targeted victims, provide evidence that establishes this as an ongoing criminal enterprise rather than just individual acts of fraud, that turns this from a few years in prison into potentially decades." "Good," I said simply. "I want him in prison for as long as legally possible. Not because I'm vindictive, but because every year he spends locked up is a year he can't do this to someone else." "There's something else you should know," Detective Morrison continued, pulling another folder from his briefcase. "After news of Jackson's arrest started circulating, we received calls from 3 additional women who believed they were victimized by him and Sienna. One in Pennsylvania, one in New Jersey, one in Massachusetts. The cases go back almost 12 years. We're still investigating, but the pattern is consistent with what you've documented. 12 years. More victims than even Vanessa had been able to identify. How many lives had Jackson destroyed? How many women had trusted him the way I had, only to discover too late that everything had been a performance? I want to help them, I said. The other victims. If there's anything I can do to support their cases or help them recover, I want to do it. Detective Morrison smiled slightly. I thought you might say that. I'll make sure you're connected with the Victim Services Coordinator. In the meantime, we'll be filing formal charges later today. Multiple counts of fraud, forgery, identity theft, and conspiracy. Jackson is looking at 15 to 20 years if convicted on all counts. The preliminary hearing was held 3 weeks later in a Brooklyn courtroom that smelled of old wood and floor polish. I sat in the gallery with my mother beside me, watching as Jackson was led in, wearing an orange jumpsuit that made him look smaller and less significant than the man who had dominated my life for 7 years. His attorney, a sharp-looking woman in an expensive suit, sat beside him, whispering what I assumed were strategic instructions. The prosecutor laid out the case with clinical precision, describing the pattern of fraud that had begun more than a decade earlier and had continued through multiple victims across multiple states. She presented evidence of forged documents, fraudulent property transfers, stolen funds that totaled well over $1 million when all victims were accounted for. She played portions of the recording I had made of Sienna, her voice filling the courtroom as she described targeting vulnerable women and stealing everything they owned. Jackson sat motionless through most of it, his face carefully neutral. But I saw his hands clench when the prosecutor mentioned Patricia Ellis and Lauren Prescott, the 2 women whose lives had ended after he had destroyed them financially. When the prosecutor finished, Jackson's attorney stood and argued that much of the evidence was circumstantial, that my recording of Sienna had been obtained under false pretenses, that Jackson had a right to present his own version of events at trial. The judge listened impassively and then set bail at $2 million, an amount Jackson could not possibly meet given that all his assets had been frozen. As they led him back out of the courtroom, Jackson's eyes found mine in the gallery. There was no pleading in his expression this time, no attempt at manipulation, just cold hatred that confirmed everything I had come to understand about who he really was. My mother reached over and squeezed my hand. "Your father would be proud of you," she whispered. "Not just for stopping Jackson, but for how you did it, with intelligence and strategy instead of just emotion." I squeezed back, feeling tears prick at my eyes for the first time since this nightmare had begun. "I wish Dad was here," I said quietly. "I wish he could have protected us from this." "He did protect us," my mother replied. "He raised you to be strong and smart and capable of protecting yourself. That's the greatest gift a parent can give." We left the courthouse together that afternoon, my mother and I walking down the stone steps into gray November light that felt appropriate for the moment. There was no celebration, no sense of victory, just a quiet exhaustion that came from carrying the weight of betrayal for so long and finally being allowed to set it down. "What happens now?" my mother asked as we reached the street where I had parked. "Now we rebuild," I said simply. "Everything he tried to destroy, we put back together, better and stronger than before." But I knew even as I spoke those words that rebuilding would be more complicated than the statement suggested. Some things, once broken, could never be fully restored to their original form. They could only be transformed into something different, something that carried the scars of what had been done to them. The months that followed Jackson's sentencing were filled with practical necessities that left little room for emotional processing. Vanessa worked with forensic accountants and law enforcement to trace the stolen funds through the maze of shell companies and offshore accounts Jackson and Sienna had created. The recovery process was slow and frustrating, complicated by the fact that a significant portion of the money had been spent on Sienna's luxury lifestyle and could never be reclaimed. Designer clothes and exotic vacations leave no assets to seize, no accounts to freeze, just receipts documenting how other people's life savings had been converted into temporary pleasures. In the end, we recovered approximately 62% of what had been stolen from me and my mother. Not everything, but enough to stabilize what Jackson had tried to destroy. I used a portion of those recovered funds to pay off my mother's brownstone completely, then worked with Martin to establish a trust that would protect the property from any future attempts at fraud or manipulation. The house that had nearly been lost was now secured in a way that gave my mother genuine peace for the first time since my father's death. Thornfield Security Solutions required a different kind of rebuilding. The company itself had survived Jackson's attempt at corporate fraud intact, thanks to the emergency injunctions Martin had filed. But the public nature of the case had raised questions among some clients about whether my personal vulnerabilities indicated weaknesses in the security protocols we provided to protect their organizations. I spent months in meetings, explaining to executives and board members how even the most sophisticated security measures could be compromised by social engineering and manipulation. How Jackson's fraud was less about technological vulnerabilities and more about human psychology. What surprised me was that most clients found my willingness to be transparent about what had happened to me more reassuring than troubling. I developed a presentation about the lessons I had learned from being targeted by a professional con artist, transforming my painful experience into educational content that helped security officers and executives recognize similar threats in their own organizations. The presentation became one of our most requested offerings, and Thornfield actually gained clients as a result of my public discussion of how manipulation and fraud operate in practice rather than just in theory. But the professional rebuilding was easier than the personal recovery. I found myself unable to trust in ways that had once come naturally. Every new person I met was evaluated through a lens of suspicion that I couldn't turn off. Every act of kindness was examined for hidden motives. Every relationship was tested for signs of manipulation or performance. I knew intellectually that this was not a healthy way to live, that Jackson had damaged something fundamental in my ability to connect with other people. But knowing something intellectually and being able to change it emotionally were entirely different challenges. Diana noticed the change in me. 6 months after Jackson's sentencing, she brought me coffee one morning and closed my office door before sitting down across from my desk. "You need to talk to someone," she said without preamble. "A therapist. I mean, someone who specializes in trauma." "I'm fine," I said automatically, the response I had been giving everyone who asked. "You're not fine, Mia. You're functioning, which is impressive given what you've been through. But functioning is not the same as healing. You've rebuilt the business and saved your mother's house and put Jackson in prison. Now you need to rebuild yourself, and that requires help." She was right, of course. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in complex trauma and betrayal. The sessions were difficult, forcing me to examine not just what Jackson had done, but how it had changed me, how it had altered my ability to exist in the world with any sense of security or trust. Dr. Warren did not push me to forgive Jackson or to release my anger or to embrace vulnerability again. Instead, she helped me understand that what I had experienced was a form of psychological violence, that my weariness and suspicion were protective mechanisms that had served an important purpose but needed to be calibrated, so they did not control my entire existence. One unexpected consequence of the case becoming public was the network of survivors who reached out to me. Women who had been targeted by similar fraud schemes, who had lost money or property or years of their lives to men who had never loved them at all. Some had been victimized by Jackson specifically, others by different predators who operated with the same calculated cruelty. We began meeting informally at first, gathering in coffee shops to share our stories and realize we were not alone in what had been done to us. Rachel Montgomery became particularly important to me during this time. She was Jackson's first known victim, the doctor in Connecticut who had lost her medical practice and nearly $400,000 before discovering the truth. Rachel had spent years blaming herself, questioning her own judgment, wondering how she could have been foolish enough to trust someone so completely. Meeting her and hearing her story helped me understand that what had happened to me was not about my intelligence or sophistication or professional competence. It was about encountering someone whose entire skill set was built around manipulation and deception. Together, Rachel and I and several other survivors formed what we called the Fraud Prevention Network. We spoke at conferences about financial crimes and domestic fraud. We wrote articles for business publications about the warning signs of systematic manipulation. We lobbied for stronger legal protections for fraud victims and better support systems for people trying to rebuild after having their lives systematically dismantled. The work gave me a sense of purpose that went beyond just my own recovery. It allowed me to believe that something good could emerge from the worst experience of my life. 2 years after that Wednesday afternoon, when I forgot my passport and accidentally uncovered the truth, I stood in my new apartment in Manhattan, looking at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The woman staring back at me was different from the person I had been. Harder in some ways, more careful, less willing to extend trust without verification, but also stronger, more resilient, more certain of her own capabilities and judgment. I had sold the Brooklyn brownstone 6 months after Jackson's sentencing. I couldn't continue living in the space where he had performed his greatest role, where every room held memories that were now contaminated by the knowledge that nothing had been real. My new apartment was smaller, a 2-bedroom in the Upper West Side with large windows that filled the space with natural light. I had decorated it carefully, with furniture I chose myself, artwork that meant something to me personally, books that lined the shelves and reminded me that knowledge and understanding were worth pursuing even when they came with pain. I dated occasionally, though never seriously. I went to dinner with men I met through work or was introduced to by friends, and I was always cordial and sometimes even enjoyed their company. But I never allowed anyone to get truly close, never let down the walls I had built to protect myself from being vulnerable again. Some people told me I was being too careful, that I needed to learn to trust again or I would spend the rest of my life alone. But I disagreed with their assessment. I was not being overly careful. I was being appropriately cautious. I had learned what human beings were capable of when given access to your trust and resources, and I had no intention of forgetting those lessons. My mother worried about me, though she tried to hide it. She would visit my apartment and comment on how quiet it was, how empty it felt, despite the furniture and artwork. She would ask if I had met anyone interesting lately, her tone carefully casual, but her concern obvious underneath. I would reassure her that I was fine, that I was focused on my work and my advocacy, and the life I was building on my own terms. She would nod and say she understood. But I could see in her eyes that she wondered whether Jackson had stolen not just money, but also my ability to believe in genuine human connection. Perhaps he had, or perhaps I had simply learned a truth about the world that other people were fortunate enough to avoid. Either way, the woman in the mirror was the woman I had become. Not broken, despite what others might think. Not damaged beyond repair. Simply changed in ways that could not be undone, carrying knowledge that could not be forgotten, living with a clarity about human nature that was both burden and protection. I thought about Jackson sometimes, locked in a federal prison upstate where he would spend the next decade and a half. I wondered if he understood what he had done, if he felt remorse for the lives he had destroyed, or if he simply regretted getting caught. I suspected the latter. People like Jackson did not experience genuine remorse because they did not see other people as fully human. We were resources to be exploited, roles to be performed, obstacles to be overcome or avoided. But he had made one critical mistake. He had targeted someone who refused to be destroyed, someone who had the resources and intelligence and sheer stubborn determination to fight back. And in doing so, he had created exactly the kind of enemy he should have feared most. The woman in the mirror smiled slightly at that thought, then turned away and went back to living the life she had built from the ruins of betrayal. If this story of strategic revenge kept you captivated until the very end, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when I stood in my foyer listening to Jackson's phone conversation, realizing in that single moment that my entire marriage had been an elaborate lie. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. I really want to hear what resonated with you.